Hello there chickens. I decided it's been a while since I rambled for a little bit about shadow work or shadow stuff or the art of exploring the seedy underbelly of the psyche anyway. There are going to be a lot of people with a lot of other perspectives on it that are also well worth listening to, and I would definitely recommend that nobody takes me as the first and last word in any of this, to be completely honest. But the idea of it and the way that I've worked with it and the way that I've kind of developed it over time and thought about it has definitely helped me, and in turn it's helped my clients since I've been working with people on, you know, exploring their stuff and figuring out what is going to be best for them and just uncovering what it is within them that they want to deal with and integrate, that they want to accept within themselves, and that they accept is actually sort of a part of them that's gone rogue and is causing trouble for them in their lives. It's really about getting clear on those parts of the psyche that have gone off the beaten track and are doing their own thing because they're not accepted, they've been rejected, and they are therefore doing their dirty work to destroy your life from the inside out. So it's really about, I think, repatriating all of those bits of you that you've shoved away in the corners, and that your ego is not really prepared to accept. And when you actually examine those parts of you and you pull them in and you try and learn about them, it stands to reason that they very often have less control over you that way, and you begin to feel that you do get your life back and you do become a more holistic version of you. You feel like you understand yourself better, you feel like you can control your responses better, you feel like you start getting closer to the life that you want to live and the relationships that you want to have. So in that sense, it's been really useful for me, and of course I love talking about it. I do have a playlist dedicated to shadow work which collects together all of the things that I've said about it on my YouTube journey so far. So if you do want to click below and check the playlist out, you'll find lots of things there to kind of explain to you what my thoughts and feelings are really on the art of shadow work, how I would recommend that you get started, techniques, etc. So definitely check that playlist out if you are new here and you're not really sure what shadow work is or what it is from my perspective, and you're wondering what I've been saying about it so far. In previous videos I have talked about the difference between ad hoc shadow work and then actually sort of determining a period of time over which you're going to examine the shadowscape in its entirety. So I'll break down both of those different things. First of all, I do think it's possible to do what I consider to be ad hoc shadow exploration, and that's basically where you find something in your psyche, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't seem to be gravy, and you want to explore it, or you don't want to explore it but you know you should. Usually most of the time that's how it happens, and basically you just recognise that it's something that needs to be confronted, and so you go in there and you have a look at that specific shadow. And then there is the type of shadow work where you make an agreement with yourself that over a number of weeks or a number of months you're going to examine actually in its entirety a lot of different parts anyway, if not all, of the shadow terrain that you can even bring to mind. So it's really going through the whole thing, exploring all of it, and there are ways to figure out what the entirety of your known shadow actually looks like anyway. So everything that you can consider to be something that you know your ego has rejected, that comes up for you and then you push it down, you can map that, and there are ways to map it, and I'm going to be sharing some of my theories on that in another video soon. The last time that I personally did a sort of shadowscape review, if you will, where I looked at everything really, or a lot of things anyway, that I consider to be in shadow for me, was at the beginning of 2016, and I was moved to do that after some experiences in 2015 that really shook me to my core and really just made me think about a lot of shit. And it was unpleasant, and it was lonely, and it was sad, and I kind of, as a result of that, realised in sort of January 2016 that it was time for a full-on shadowscape review, as it were. And I kind of made a map, and I was like, okay, this is everything that I feel anyway that I can put my finger on that really ought to be examined. There are going to be some bits and pieces that I know are there that I don't necessarily feel need to be raked over, but definitely at the beginning of 2016 there were a lot of different things on that map, and I was really getting clear with myself about going in and doing a deep dive, as they say, and just sort of traversing the entire terrain. And I did that, and certainly some really interesting things came out of that. But more often than not, what I do is I ad hoc shadow work. So I see something, I clock it, and I'm like, wow, that's uncomfortable. Where did that come from? Or I didn't think I was like that. Or I feel shame around that part of me that I've just exhibited, or that comment that I've just sort of glibly thrown out there. What does that mean about me? Where's that coming from? That kind of shadow work is what I would consider, for me anyway, to be the ad hoc variety, where I'm like, okay, I need to go in there and look at that one specific thing. Let me see what's going on with me there, etc. The first thing I do when I find a piece of material like that I come across and I feel a reaction, like I want to push it down, or I want to deny it, or I'm really appalled by it, is I say it out loud. On my own, not in front of a crowd of people. I say it out loud to myself, and I also commit it to paper. I write it down. Doesn't necessarily have to be in a shadow work book where you keep all of your shadow work stuff together, but for me it certainly brings it into reality if I actually have the bravery to write it down. And it does often take bravery to commit thoughts like that to paper, whether you're going to keep the piece of paper or not, to be honest, because it just feels so much more real when you write it down. It feels like you're actually signing a contract with yourself, and the contract is an agreement that you're going to look at this thing that you probably don't want to look at, and that you might be trying to convince yourself you don't have time to look at, but you're going to look at it, and it's an agreement with yourself that that's what you're going to do. I then start to figure out how it's negatively held me back. How is it negatively affecting me? What is it doing to me, to my relationships, to my creative life, my spiritual life? Whereabouts is it causing an issue? This helps me to confirm my reasons for actually wanting to work through it, because obviously there is a lot of resistance when you first come across a piece of shadow material, especially if you either have never come across it before, or you have come across it before many times and you thought you'd fucking figured it out. And suddenly you're like, why can't I just deal with this? Why does this keep coming up? And that can be a frustration as well, and that can lead to a lot of people wanting to just be like, I'm not touching this again. I'm fed up with myself, I'm angry with myself, and then it moves into a place of self-criticism quite often. So once I understand the ways in which it's negatively affecting me, or it's negatively affecting others, then I understand why it's important to work on it, even though I might feel a level of resistance towards working on it. At that point I've kind of gotten real, and it feels a lot more like it's something that I can confirm is an issue, and I've clocked it and I want to do something about it. I don't want to eradicate it, I don't want to be angry with it, I don't want to push it aside. I just want to understand it, and usually understanding it starts with trying to determine where it might have come from. For me, I'm really interested in the origin. I'm interested in why I'm experiencing a specific thing. Why do I hold a specific view? Why do I want to behave a certain way around this person? What is at the core of it? And obviously that is a great deal of the work, I think, is just figuring out like where did this come from? Where did it begin? A lot of the time, a piece of shadow content has a very obvious origin to me, but not all of the time. Sometimes I'm stumped by something that I come across that my ego vehemently wants to reject, that I do not want to really examine, especially things that I feel about people that I love, that I feel are judgy or, you know, overly critical. I don't want to look at that. I don't want to look at that, and so as a result I often take longer to figure out where the fuck that's coming from. And also sometimes it's just coming from a place that I'm ashamed of, and a place that I consider to be unpleasant. Whether it takes me a long time to get to the source of the issue, or whether it takes me a very short time and it's a very straight road and it's very understandable, either way it's usually good to then voice that out loud and then also write that down, because that kind of work leads to often a very fruitful place, but then it's uncomfortable to sit with that. Say, for example, you realise that you're struggling to be happy for your friend, even though they are at probably the pinnacle of their life. It's great for them, everything's coming up roses, and you are really resentful and you're hoping everything's going to come crashing down. Not only is it probably really unpleasant for you to have to admit to yourself that you feel that about someone you love and care for, but then when you get to the source of the issue, it's probably going to be even more difficult. Like maybe you don't want them to succeed because you don't want them to leave you, and you don't want them to somehow evolve beyond you. You want them to stay stuck in the same crappy cycle that you feel that you're in, so you can stay connected. Or maybe you realise that this friend reminds you of a sibling that you've always been in fierce competition with, and you feel like they've always come out on top, and somehow you feel if you win against your friend then you finally won against your sibling. These are sources for the issue. And when you find those sources, often that's not very pleasant, and so you get to a plateau in the work, which is great, which is of benefit to you, but then it could be just as easy to turn around and be like, you know what, I really don't want to look at that, that's just horrible. So the best thing to do is when you come to the root, when you come to the source, if indeed you do, because not everybody's shadow exploration is the same, But for me, I'm looking for the source most often. So, and I do that with my clients as well. I say it out loud, and again, I commit it to paper. I feel like my relationship with the parts of me that I'm trying to hide or suppress has become increasingly positive over time. And when I want to explore a particular part of me that I'm not happy with, that I'm not comfortable with, I find it reasonably easy to give myself love in that moment and to avoid self-judgment in that moment. It used to be much harder for me to do that, but I do feel like I'm at a certain point on my journey now where I can get to the source of an issue and I can really confirm for myself that yes, I am definitely in my feelings about this, and I definitely feel some kind of shadowy way about it, or I'm clearly operating in some kind of unpleasant way, and it doesn't immediately go to a place of self-criticism. I tend to find that once I've found the source or the origin, and I really can understand both the behaviour and its origin, that's the perfect time for me to swoop in with self-loving words for myself, words of encouragement, words of praise for doing that work, because otherwise there is a vacuum there that can sometimes be filled with a lot of self-criticism and self-mockery, or berating yourself, or just being disgusted by what you found inside your own psyche. And that's obviously not conducive to the work. Like, obviously you're going to come across feelings like that when you are exploring something that your ego has been rejecting and not wanting to look at, but you don't want to drop anchor there. So obviously I feel like once I've found the source of the issue, one very important thing to do is to jump in with the positive self-talk and just really affirm the work that I've done, and to know that your ego goes off in all kinds of skew-if directions. It doesn't mean that you want to believe the hype. It doesn't mean that you want to go with what your ego is doing or saying or feeling. You can step away from yourself. You can detach and examine yourself objectively and say, okay, I feel this because of this, this and this. There's something about it that makes sense, and so I know that I'm not doing it to be malicious. I know that I'm trying to do the work to understand it differently and integrate it. Like a lot of people who've done work on the hidden parts of myself and the rejected parts of myself, I have absolutely been disgusted by some of the things that I've thought and felt, definitely, and some of my actions as well, especially some of my private thoughts. When I've clocked a private thought and it's occurred to me to be shocked by it, that's a real moment for me. That is an entire mood for me. I could definitely run away from that, and I have run away from it many times, but I am more inclined to go towards it now. If I clock myself in a moment where I'm thinking something and I come in and observe that thought and I'm like, where is that coming from? That is totally out of left field, and that is mean, or that is odd, you know? I'm far more likely to swoop in to that, zoom in on it and be like, this is material, let me focus on this. This is something important, rather than to push it away and be like, oh, I'm horrible, I don't even know why, I'm so ashamed, I feel so small, I feel so disempowered. I'd prefer to kind of zoom in on that and not judge myself. But obviously it was a long road to getting there. And in the earliest days of me looking at some of the crappy things that I was thinking and feeling and doing, I definitely had a lot more self-criticism. I definitely had a lot more self-mockery. But you get to a point where you know that you need to nurture yourself in the work that you're doing. And you need to acknowledge that it's good work that you're doing. I know I'm always banging on about holding your own hand and being your own friend, but I bang on about it because it's true and it's helped. It's helped me tremendously to remember that. So that's why I bang on about it so much. I sometimes find myself in this really interesting place after I've confirmed for myself what I'm doing or thinking or whatever and what the source of it is, when I then go on to consider what my life would be like if I wasn't labouring under the weight of this shadow. And I ask myself what the lives of those that I love around me would be like if I wasn't labouring under this shadow. I ask myself what I could potentially achieve, what I could do for myself and others if that shadow was dealt with and integrated. Again, this gives me a lot of impetus to keep going on to the next stage. Now, for me, the next stage is more spiritual in nature, because I do tend to find that ritual for me confirms something, and it brings my understanding of it and my acceptance of it into actuality. And for me, very often it's only then that I can start to take action and I can start to experiment and I can start to play with different ways of allowing the shadow to come into the light and sit comfortably with the rest of who I am, rather than trying to ignore it or pretend it's not there, you know, and then it gets a little bit out of control and it's a bit ugly and it starts to look like the Tower card because I haven't really sorted it out, kind of thing. I know for a lot of people ritual isn't necessarily a part of their shadow work, but for me, ritual, spiritual practice, you know, talking with my goddesses, etc., drawing cards, being in sacred space, sitting with the realizations, all of that is a part of my process. If ritual and spiritual practice and stuff like that isn't your thing, then you're still probably going to need to allow yourself some time to feel your feelings about what you have actually come across. You know, you can't stumble upon a piece of shadow material and find that it is significant enough that you need to write it down, you need to think about how it's affecting you, you need to think about what your life would be if that shadow wasn't dominating you, and then skip over the feeling part of it. You do need to sit with it. And sometimes you feel incredibly sad, you look back at the timeline of your life and you realise you've been labouring under this shadow for a really long time, and you realise it's harmed people. It may even have severed relationships with people you love. You may realise that it is an ancestral pattern, that it's come down to you through your mother's mother's mother or whatever, and again that creates an incredible sense of resentment, disappointment, bewilderment, confusion, shock, you know. So I think you do still need to sit with those feelings. For me, doing that in a spiritual context is really useful and helpful. It's about knowing that now you comprehend the shadow and its source, you have an opportunity to respond to it in the moment, rather than responding to it in hindsight with horror on your face. You actually have an opportunity to choose your response in the moment. It's not about eradicating the shadow. That was what I was trying to do before, and that was what was making the shadow gain a foothold and take control of my behaviour or my thoughts or whatever. So for me, it's about acknowledging why it's there, and then knowing that I have an opportunity to clock it in the moment and choose differently in terms of how I actually process it and how I function in the midst of it. So this is just an example literally from my own work, right? I have always had a bit of a shadow throughout my whole teens and adult life, around people whose parents have helped them out financially with like buying them a house, buying them a car. I have that shadow for a very understandable collection of reasons, which I have explored in shadow work. Now I've had friends and partners whose parents were very present for them financially throughout their lives, and who definitely did not have to experience the sense of instability and the lack of a safety net that other people had to experience. And I have noticed over time that my shadow around that topic has definitely gotten in the way on a few occasions, and I've had to deal with it. I discovered that shadow in my mid-20s, right? I'm now nearly in my mid-30s, and I can tell you now that just as recently as last summer, I had a very negative reaction to something that someone was saying about their parental figures being involved in a big financial purchase for them, like an investment purchase that was going to help them to get a foothold, blah, 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 blah. That shadow came up in me, and I responded initially in a hostile, dismissive, sarcastic, judgy kind of way. Immediately after doing so, I became very emotional and I apologised. And I said that this is just to do with me, it's my personal shit, and I understand why I had that reaction. But the point that I'm trying to make in offering you a slice of my own shadow experience is that I discovered that shadow almost 10 years ago. Has it gone away? Has it fuck? Did I respond negatively as little as a year ago? Yeah, I did. But I quickly realised where that had come from, and there have been a number of other occasions in the same vein where I've been talking to someone or about someone and it's gotten onto the topic of parents, you know, making sure their children are financially stable and the children not necessarily having to work full time or whatever because their parents are there for them. And I've clocked it even before I've allowed myself to have the hostile emotional response, because I know that that shadow is there and I know the origin of it. Is it possible that I will ever cease completely to have that difficult, negative emotional response to that kind of topic? I don't know. I hope so, and I'm working towards it, and I want that to be the case very much. But I also acknowledge that that response that I have comes from a very deep and complicated place, which I have explored in my shadow work. And I acknowledge that it may take a great deal of time for the wires behind that particular topic to be cut completely so that it doesn't go to a deeply emotional place for me. What I'm aiming for really, rather than, you know, cutting the wires completely, because obviously that's going to be hard to do, there's a lot of stuff around that topic, but what I'm aiming for really is to be able to see that shadow come up literally every time, as soon as that topic arises, to acknowledge that yes, I'm having a feeling, I'm having a bunch of feelings, it's not pleasant, I want to lash out, and actually being able to control that response. And I've done a great deal of work in that area on that particular shadow, and it's mostly gone really well for me, and I have been able to be happy for people who are in that situation and to empathise with their position. I can see things from their point of view, and that's work that I've done. So I am realistic when I look at shadow stuff. I'm not necessarily telling myself that I can completely cut off from the emotional response, which is clearly deeply rooted in past experiences and difficulties that I've encountered and whatnot. But I think what I'm looking for more than anything is the ability to be able to choose, to be able to clock that shadow material and choose how I'm going to respond, and know that I do not have to drag another human being into what is frankly my personal bullshit. It's nothing to do with them, it's about me, and it's about what I've been through, and it's about the way that I place that frame of reference on the situation, which has got nothing to do with me and is not in any way the same as what I encountered and what I have gone through. I would definitely ask you to consider how realistic you're being about the idea of exploring the stuff that is causing a problem for you, that you really don't like about yourself, that is uncomfortable, that's causing issues in your relationships. Because if you're wanting this kind of blank, clean slate energy, that's not as likely. Again, I'm not saying that other people don't have other experiences, I'm not saying that other people don't have other theories on it, but for me, realism is a key part of exploring shadow stuff, because I don't want to tell myself that the only desirable outcome is to have had all the wires cut and to feel like that's never going to bother me again, and I can't even remember ever being bothered by it. Because I can't erase my past, I can't erase what I've been through, I can't erase the frame of reference that I was raised with. But what I can do is accept that it doesn't have to bring my house down around me, and it doesn't have to destroy my relationships with people who've had lives that are very different from mine. It doesn't have to cause me to behave as a lesser version of myself that I look back on with the benefit of hindsight and think, why did I behave like that? That was just so not okay. It has been amazing. Obviously, shadow work in general has been amazing, but working on that shadow has been amazing because I've come to this point in my life now where I realise that there are all kinds of complexities and neuroses and negativity for people who are provided for well by their parents. There's a whole other set of issues around that people need to work through and people need to talk about. And I was seeing it in a completely skewed way where I was not holding any space for that at all in my mid-20s, and that was really shit of me. I totally forgive myself and I totally understand why I was like that and why I held those kinds of views, but shadow work helped me to just pull that up and look at it and integrate it. When I examine a piece of shadow stuff, I don't necessarily want to end the exploration by saying to myself, good, that's done and dusted, that's sorted out, that's never going to come back again. I'm much more interested in a state of play where I reach the end and I think, I've got an awareness of that now, and that awareness is never going to be reversed. I know that that is a part of me, and I understand where it comes from, and that gives me a lot of access to empowerment and freedom. That to me is a much more realistic way of viewing it. I mean, let me know what you guys think. I know a lot of you that watch me are on your own explorations of shadow stuff and looking into the things that you might have been running away from for a long time or that might not be pleasant to explore. I would love to know what you think about the idea of realism with regard to the results of a shadow exploration. That's where I'm coming from with it, and that's what's always felt more realistic and manageable for me. So once all of that's done, I start to think about what kinds of actions I want to take. So how will I behave next time? What kinds of things will I do for myself and for other people to ensure that I don't allow that piece of my shadow to write a really crappy story for me that I really didn't like and that wasn't good. This is a really interesting part of the work because it's a bit experimental in nature. So for me, I've found that I've got certain shadows around certain subjects or in certain scenarios or with certain people or whatever. And I find the action part of the shadow work process really interesting because a lot of the time for me, it's about intentionally going into that situation and finding ways to handle it in a much better manner. And this is particularly true with people around whom I've felt a lot of tension after maybe not long of being around them, or maybe in a certain scenario with them, and I might love them and they might be an important part of my life, but at the same time there might be a lot of contention there. It might be a very fractious energy between us for a bunch of reasons. So once I've figured out what those reasons are and why I want to do the work to integrate this understanding of myself, then it's interesting because normally what I want to do is I want to get my tools together, like choose my weapons, and then I want to go back into that situation and see if I can respond differently. And the other person, you know, hasn't necessarily done any work per se to think about how they're going to change towards me. They may have the exact same behaviours around me. They may say exactly the same things that really got up my nose before, but I'm the one working on stuff now. So it will be down to me to decide to respond differently and to decide to process the experience differently. And that has worked fucking wonders. It really has. Especially when I go back into that situation knowing that I've set some boundaries for myself, that there are some things that are no-go areas for me, some things that I'm not going to allow myself to say or do, because all that's doing is giving power to the shadow, and it's not really what I think and it's not really what I want to do. And then it's about deciding, you know, how is it appropriate to respond in a way that aligns with who I really am, where I don't allow my shadows just overtake and run off over the hills in a way that leaves me afterwards feeling really shitty and really like, I don't even know what, that just got control of me. You know, I'm trying to step away from that, so it's about being conscious. I might decide that there are certain things that I really need to remember and bring my attention to before I spend time in a specific scenario. I might decide that there are shadows around a particular thing that require me to do certain practical things to deal with it. So a number of steps that I know I've been ignoring or overlooking, etc. That kind of stuff. I might go through certain scenarios in my head where previously I would have definitely allowed the shadow side to just take over, and I might think, okay, here's scenario A, B and C. From now on, this is the direction I'm not going to go in because it never goes anywhere good. I acknowledge there's a shadow in this area, but this is how I'm going to choose to deal with it. I'm going to step away, I'm going to take some breaths, I'm not going to approach that topic, I'm going to set a boundary, whatever I've got to do, right? To make it into a better experience for me and potentially also the people around me next time. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's not enough to just recognise that there is this bit of shadow here and to name it and to source its origin and to be like, okay, you know, I've done a ritual or I've had a cry and that's the end of it. You have to challenge yourself in some way, I think, anyway. And it could be through a series of different actions, or it could be just through one key decision that you're going to make about a mental shift or a behavioural shift or a good thing you're going to do for yourself that makes you less susceptible to go down that shadowy route that never goes anywhere good. I take certain actions or put certain experiments into play. I look at those actions that I put into place and I think to myself, did this make it easier to deal with the shadow when it came up? Did it make it quicker for me to see the shadow and respond to it? How did it go differently than the way I've dealt with it before? Sometimes I identify something shadowy and there's not really an opportunity so much for me to do anything about it. There's not really anything practical or anything in terms of experimentation or trying something different because it just doesn't come up again for a really long time. But the value of recognising it is the value of knowing that when it does come up, I have an opportunity to see if I can do things differently or reframe the situation. And it's not in spite of the shadow, it's kind of because of it in a way. I have no interest in judging myself for the shadowy bits that I find that have gone rogue, that the ego has shut out of the equation. I want to accept that those things are there. I want to accept that they're a part of me. I want to understand where they've come from, which further helps me to accept them and to be accepting of myself in light of them. And then I want to think about what I can do to minimize the damage that they're causing. To me, that is really just very boiled down what it is to explore the shadow. And obviously there's loads of different ways and means of figuring out what's actually in your shadow. But I suppose in terms of the ad hoc clocking of something that comes to you in a moment and you go, oh my God, that's there. I think that's the best way of dealing with it for me, is just to acknowledge it, confirm it by speaking it and writing it, thinking about, you know, the origin of it, and then thinking about what my life would be like if it wasn't there, what kinds of damage would not be caused, what kinds of issues probably wouldn't come up anymore. Doing the spiritual stuff to confirm that I've done that hard work, feeling my feelings about finding this thing in my shadow, which sometimes those feelings are dramatic and unpleasant. And sometimes a little bit tiring as well, like, oh, we're back here again, this is another fucking thing that I didn't think was going to come up in me anymore, and why is it coming up again, or why is it coming up in this different guise? And you know what, a lot of people do over time mention that kind of thing to me. They do say to me, like, I've worked on this, I worked on this a year ago, I worked on this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I thought it was done and dusted. What is going on, Kellyanne? Why is it back? Why is it back with a vengeance? And I often just say, you know, when we shed a skin, sometimes we do need to re-explore something from the new place. We might look at it from the vantage point that we have arrived at and realise that there are parts of it that we couldn't see from where we were before, and we need to re-examine it. Sometimes you just simply do not come across a scenario that reminds you of it or makes you tap into it for a really long time. So you don't realise that you might still be susceptible to it, and there's no weakness in still being susceptible to it. With some of the things that I have known are shadowy for me for years and years and years, I've been on my best behaviour with them for years and years and years. I've known that they're there, I deal with them fine, I've accepted that they're a part of me, and I don't make them into anyone else's problem, and I don't take them to a really crappy place, right? And then once in a blue moon, just like what happened last summer with that issue that I have about parental generosity, financial parental generosity or whatever, there just comes this point where something's different. It's like a specific situation or a specific relationship, something different that really just pokes at it in a different way, and I realise it's not quite been put to sleep, and that's okay. It's okay. Sometimes it's where you are in your life as well, you know, if you're feeling strong, if you're feeling like you're on the up and up, if you're feeling supported by spirit or by people around you, then you might be much better equipped at dealing with some of your shadow stuff than when you hit your lowest point. And I think for me that's very true, that when I feel vulnerable and unsafe and unstable, and maybe my, you know, mental well-being is playing up, maybe there's depression involved, whatever, I definitely can trip over shadow content that I normally definitely have a handle on, and I can disarm it fairly quickly, and I'm like, oh, I know I can get shadowy about that. You know, it's okay. I understand why I'm feeling that way, but let me not make it everyone else's problem right now. Sometimes, depending on the situation I'm going through, if there is some difficulty that I'm particularly encountering, I may be more susceptible to fall flat on my face and then look back with hindsight and go, ooh, I was a bit catty in that situation, or a bit distant, or a bit fucking weird. I felt a bit fucking weird about that. Damn it. If you're thinking about a particular shadow that you're trying to deal with, and you're thinking, well, I don't know the origin, I don't understand where this comes from, I don't understand why I behave this way or why it bugs me, sometimes it is useful to talk to somebody else about it, either professionally or personally. I frankly have had some really interesting conversations with people who know me, who care about me, who have just held some space for me to talk until I, you know, work out what the terrain is, and they may interject and say, well, have you thought about this, or I've actually noticed that you are a bit more like this, or whatever. But if you can find those people who also, like me, appreciate the benefit of hashing something out rather than just trying to immediately go to solutions, which is the mode for a lot of people but not for me. I like to hash things out, and I find that I come up with a lot of answers while I'm talking. If you can find someone like that who will go with you on that journey, that is very useful. But of course there is always the danger of bias, and there's always the danger of someone being too damn close to the situation, and there's always the danger as well of you fearing the vulnerability that it sometimes takes to open up to someone who actually is in your life, who actually knows you, who has a working relationship with you. And that's why sometimes it's important to go and speak to a professional about it and pay a professional to talk to about it, because there is that sense of objectivity most of the time, hopefully anyway, and that sense that the space that's being held is space that you have carved out, like that is your sacred time, and you most of the time as well anyway don't need to worry about that other person having some kind of vested interest or agenda, which a lot of the time might be unbeknownst to them. You know, I've had conversations with friends that started out pretty neutral about things I was going through or experiencing, and it quickly became aware that there was an agenda for them, or they were pushing a particular narrative that they didn't even realise they were pushing, and it became clear that it wasn't so much about providing me with a neutral space as it was about pushing their particular narrative. So that can be difficult, but you just have to clock that. And a lot of the time it's easy to spot, to be honest. One of the reasons that I've found it really interesting working with personified deity in a kind of archetypal, energetic kind of context is that it really provides me with talk time. And it's obviously it's not the kind of talk time that you would have with a friend, and it's not the kind of talk time you'd have with a professional either. It's kind of not really either of those things. I know a lot of people don't understand how I can still identify as a pantheist and work with goddesses, but honestly it is just so elementary to me. It makes so much sense in my head, and when I try and explain it, sometimes I think I lose people. And I've even had a couple of emails from people saying, I'm so disappointed that you've moved away from pantheism, and I'm just gutted because you were the person that switched me on to the whole theological framework. And I'm like, I'm a fucking pantheist. There's no two ways about it. I know what I'm doing, and I know that there's a psycho-spiritual reason for it. And a big part of the reason that I work with personified deity is because that talk time is really healthy and interesting. And I think it's really just a talk with my inner self, where all of these beings and archetypes are housed anyway, because they're housed inside all of us. And we can't really know any different, because we can only know consciousness. Because without consciousness, what the fuck is anything anyway? We don't know. So to me it makes sense, and I'm not saying by any means that everybody should run out and grab some deities and start talking to them about their shit, but for me it definitely has been helpful in that way. There's a video on my shadow work playlist called How to Begin and What to Expect, and in that video I mentioned that there is no need to begin your shadow work from the point of childhood. There are actually lots of people who fall into exploring their shadowy sides through the ad hoc situation that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, where you just stumble across something one day through making an off-colour remark or exploding at someone or something and then thinking, what the fuck was that? And then you suddenly realise that's your way in. It's not necessarily childhood, it's not necessarily beginning from the beginning and recalling all of your life story and getting everything on a timeline. That's not going to be the right thing for everyone, and it's not going to feel healthy for everyone. So meet yourself where you are with the shadow stuff. You know, if you come across some piece of content and you know that you want to work on that, you may find that you then figure out that there are other things you need to work on in tandem with that, or that are connected to that, or whatever. But you're allowed to just delve in to figure out that thing. You're allowed to. You do not have to go from A to B in a very rigid way. And I think a lot of people kind of tell themselves that that's what they need to do, and that's not the case at all. I really hope these thoughts and impressions have been useful for you. I just felt like talking about some stuff that I'm thinking about lately and going through lately, and hopefully some of this stuff has reached people who needed it in this moment in time. Don't forget, darlings, if you do want to book a spiritual counselling session with me, you can do so. I'll leave the link to that particular purchase option down below. Bear in mind though, if you are watching this at the time of upload, there are no sessions left in July, guys. I'm fully booked for July, so you will be booking from August onwards. As always, it's a pleasure to spend time with you, and I very much look forward to reading your comments. So much love and blessed be, darlings. Mwah.